Welcome, everyone. This is the Loud Sound Epicenter podcast. I'm your host, Aaron, as always. Today, we'll be talking about the 1980s. We have our Tommy Vercetti shirt on and our Hunter S. Thompson glasses. So, we're in store for a very exciting episode of the show. Last week was a lot tamer than our first episode of the series. Cannot guarantee that for this episode because this decade, more than all the others, and definitely within the century, it is probably the most celebrated one. Yet there is a specific way that people talk about the 80s. So for this show, we'll be focusing on the gatekeeping in the 1980s music industry and the different ways that they do it. Last week, I mentioned one of the themes for this show for tonight is the radio, and because it hasn't changed in 40 years. So, and there's a reason for that, but it might include some of us that listen to it. So, to start it off, I think most people would lay all the blame on the radio stations. And it's understandable why, because most people, including myself, don't know exactly how it works. But it's not hard to imagine how bureaucratic it must be. You can picture a disc jockey getting a selection of about 100 songs, maybe less, from somebody. And it's all from greatest hits material from the best-selling bands of the time. And if that's the way it goes, I honestly can't even hardly blame them, because if I was in that job position, that would be like a dream job for me. So I could imagine not really putting up much resistance, and I'd probably, fair to say that most people probably would go along with it. Yet, however, I think there's another side to this, and it's something that doesn't go over too well with a lot of fans, and especially when it comes from bands and critics. So I want to lay out a case and be totally diplomatic, because there is something that can be left behind before the lockdowns. When we start to get our concerts back, like it's starting to right now, this can be a new standard moving forward. And I'll bring it back to the radio in a second. When you go to a concert, there are a lot of cool people, and maybe you see where this is going already, but there's a lot of people with insight, and some people that you have a lot in common, probably share the same interest outside of the show. And there's also some people that are at the concert because it's an event. And not to say that they aren't a fan, not saying that. But you will notice that they are not sober at these shows, and everybody can see it. And I bring that up because it doesn't make sense to drink at these shows. And ironically, people are drinking during the opening band a lot of times, which is weird because you are more sober during the bands you don't want to see and less focused for the bands you do want to see. Now, some people might hear that and say, okay, well, I'll drink at a later part of the show. And that's not what I'm saying to do, because I'm saying it's not worth drinking at shows, period. And to bring it back to the radio, most people go along with what gets played on the radio the same way people drink at shows, because it is available. Another example, when people call into the radio and they have the option to request whatever song they want, they tend to pick songs that the radio station was probably already going to play, meaning the greatest hits material. So we don't need the radio stations to hold us back. We get in our own way by default. And whether it's drinking at the shows or going along with what the radio plays for us, both of these can be left behind. And I think it would be beneficial to everybody, including the people that do these things as of right now. When we get our concerts back, maybe we can keep this stuff in mind and rethink some of the stuff that we don't have to do. Now, to get into another aspect of the radio, this is something that is so typical. It's weird that it is this way. We ran the numbers for you guys. So we have our citations. It's not just me rambling. We have a source. This is from the Billboard throughout the years, specifically the 80s, of course. And let me see here. Now, to have some kind of reference, as I said, because you turn on the radio and what do you hear? You hear the same 3 Bon Jovi songs, you hear the same 2 Journey songs, Permanent Vacation, so on and so on. You can cross-reference that with the best-selling material at the time. And that's no secret, of course. And if we look at, and this is the list of Billboard mainstream rock #1 songs of the 1980s. And you'll find, as expected, Tom Petty is the most recurring artist to have the #1 song on Billboard. Other repeating artists are Don Henley, Peter Gabriel, and you'll notice it's the same list of songs to this day. Now, altogether, this sums up the decade in terms of popularity. It's also a narrow list of soft rock, mostly. This is a list of commercial, buttoned-up songs tailored for a mass audience. It's a lot of bands, enough to stretch for 40 years now on the radio. But within this list, there is so much missing from the decade. And it's funny because it makes sense. Now, they won't let us have our extreme genres. Fair enough. A lot of that stuff is inaccessible. Totally get it. Now, okay, fine. So let's work within the formula according to their standards. I guess Steve Perry is always going to be the face of the 80s. Will that ever be challenged? I don't know. It doesn't look like it. So Journey is the perfect, accessible band. Men and women rally behind it. You got the melodic rock and you got the ballads. So it totally meets the standards of what's acceptable on the radio. Now, wait a second. Oh, okay. So, okay, that's how it is. What about Joe Lynn Turner? And if that is not similar to Joe Perry, or Steve Perry, then who is? Why is he not in similar rotation? Nothing controversial about him. He's playing the same type of music for the same type of audience. Classic rock, ballads. Everyone gets what they want, yet he is snubbed from the commercial standard. Another example. One of the main critiques of 80s metal, hard rock, etc. is they say that we are the ignorant ones. Our genre is one-dimensional. We could never compete with other musicians that are working with a wider range of genres. Then what about Glenn Hughes? Probably the best singer in our genre. Shouldn't even be hanging out with us, honestly. He deserves the Aretha Franklin treatment as one of the all-time greats. He's playing soul, funk, blues, rock, and yet you have to be on our corner of Twitter. Someone has to recommend him to you and say he was in Deep Purple, he's in this band Trapeze. There has to be investigating to find out who he is. Does anybody have to investigate Steve Perry or Journey? Does anybody have to investigate Queen? And those are in the same tier as the best. And yet, Glenn Hughes also snubbed for being in the same category too. So we have our radio-friendly musicians. Even if you just look at people that were in Yngwie Malmsteen's band, Deep Purple. And speaking of Deep Purple, I know this album it's not in the 80s, far from it. But Stormbringer, whether you like it or not, that album shows how much material our genre can offer at a moment's notice. And when people say they don't like classic rock, I almost don't even blame them because they're not playing half of the best stuff on the radio. You would have to investigate to find it. And of course, not to go total boomer, but people listen to music on Spotify, shuffle, they shouldn't have to investigate. The radio should be rotating enough material instead of recycling the same old stuff. So that's the 80s, or the 80s, one version of it. It's a great decade, but it'd be nice if they could show all of it. I was with some friends a while ago, and someone played that song by The Outfield, and it's just like, would it ruin radio stations to play, our pop songs, our Yngwie Malmsteen melodic, stuff like Survivor, If you don't want to play our heavy hard rock, totally get it. But like I have here, the best albums per each year of the decade. If you want to go along with go in the same vein as REO Speedwagon, Asia, which were two of the best-selling albums of the 80s, we can do that stuff too. And yet, people are so content with, the greatest hits material. No, but let's play, let's listen to the same songs from Appetite. Yeah, that's great. That's really cool. So we got some of that energy from the first episode. It's good to have that back. Now I got all my all my data is all over the place. So next week is the last episode of this series. It went by so fast. It's okay. I should mention also this Friday, July 23rd, there is going to be an HBO documentary called, it's about Woodstock 99, called Woodstock 99, Peace, Love, and Rage. And I'll be reviewing that as a separate video, separate from the series. And then next week, which it's perfect how it lined up with the show, as I said last week, we're going to be going through some abstract concepts around Woodstock and, of course, the 90s overall. It's going to be a lot of content to get through, so stay tuned for that. Stay tuned for the review. And yeah, this series will reach the end of the century. So stay tuned for that. You're going to want to check it out. Thank you again. I'd like to hear, what do you guys think about the 80s? I know for most people, they've been force-fed, especially recently with TV shows, movies, the 80s nostalgia. And there's been all kinds of videos describing it. Why do we cling to the 80s, So it's a very optimistic decade. And I do like it. Like I said, it's just, I'd like to hear some songs from Trilogy, stuff like that. Stuff like, Over Here. So yeah, Over Here too. So yeah, plenty of melodic stuff that is not hardcore, accessible for mass consumption. So thank you again for watching. I want to hear what you guys think. Is what you think about the 80s, does it fall in line with what I said, or some other commentary you'd like to share? I'm always happy to hear it. Thank you again for watching, and have a great rest of your day.